One of my favourite scenes from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings is the one in the Two Towers where Saruman is speaking to Sauron through the Palantir, stating that none can stand against the power of Isengard and Mordor. So Christopher Lee's voice, with the Mordor soundtrack in the background and the visuals of Barad-dûr, combine for an absolutely amazing scene. But just how accurate is this scene? Despite often being painted as such, were Sauron and Saruman truly allies? Could this scene have actually happened? Let's find out. A while back, I made a video where I talked about when exactly Saruman became evil. After all, he was originally on the side of good. Saruman's descent into evil began with his increasing interest in ring lore, and ended with him being ensnared by Sauron through the use of the Palantir. But it's a little more complex than that, and it's important to understand the context behind Saruman's fall into evil so that one can properly understand the relationship between Saruman and Sauron. Saruman's infatuation with ring lore eventually led to him being obsessed with the idea of claiming the One Ring for himself, even while being the leader of the White Council and officially being opposed to Sauron. After a while, he begins to put these self-interests above the greater good. In 2851, Saruman rejects the idea of driving Sauron out of Dol Guldur because he believes the One Ring will only reveal itself if Sauron is in the picture. Fast forward 90 years to 2941, Saruman changes his mind and advocates for Sauron to be driven from Dol Guldur, which he is. Why? Because Sauron's forces were searching the Gladden Fields, where Isildur lost the One Ring, and Saruman was becoming increasingly worried that Sauron would find the One Ring first. After this, Saruman isolates himself in Isengard, fortifies it with the help of the Dunlendings, and later begins recruiting and then breeding orcs. Sometime around 3000, after using the Palantir for about 20 years, Saruman finds himself face to face with Sauron, who is using the Ithil Stone. Sauron corrupts Saruman into joining him, and they form a secret alliance, which isn't revealed until Saruman imprisons Gandalf atop Orthanc in July 3018. Afterwards, at least on a surface level, Isengard and Mordor appear to be allies. However, this alliance isn't so simple. In terms of their ultimate goal, Sauron and Saruman are on the same page. Remember, both of them were once students of Aule and have fairly similar mindsets. They love order and control. In terms of their armies and war plans, they're also on the same page. They both want a new world order and are aware that certain enemies must be destroyed before that comes to fruition. While Saruman will attack Rohan, Sauron will attack Gondor. So it can definitely be said that Isengard and Mordor shared a military alliance. But on a personal level, this alliance was little more than an act. Why? Because despite basically being vassalized by Sauron, Saruman still wanted the One Ring for himself, meaning that Saruman still wanted absolute power. So in the lead up to the War of the Ring, Saruman betrays Sauron repeatedly, but only when it involves the One Ring. When Sauron captures Gollum and learns of Baggins and the Shire, he dispatches his servants to find out the who and the where, but they are never successful in turning up any information. This is partially due to Saruman instructing his own servants to mislead or waylay Sauron's servants whenever they became too close to the truth. And unfortunately for Saruman, Sauron became aware of this betrayal, and was obviously livid, but decided to keep this hidden for the time. This changes when Sauron unleashes the Nazgul in June 3018 to hunt for the One Ring. For almost 3 months, the Nazgul are met with failure. They're searching the Vales of Anduin, far from the Shire. So Sauron gives them new instructions. Go and have a friendly chat with Saruman. When the Witch King arrives at the gates of Isengard, Saruman is already in a bad mood because Gandalf had escaped atop Gwaihir only 2 days earlier. The Witch King arriving and asking about the Shire could only mean one thing. Sauron knew that Saruman knew about the Shire, which means he knew that Saruman had been betraying him. Instead of trying to redeem himself, Saruman decides to double down on his betrayal. He convinces the Witch King that he knows nothing of the Shire, and that if the Nazgul want to know where it is, they should find Gandalf, who should still be nearby. Unfortunately for Saruman, the Nazgul don't find Gandalf, but they do find Grima Wormtongue, who quickly spills the beans, and reveals that Saruman does know about the Shire, and knows its location as well. The Nazgul leave, and while passing through Minhiriath, they capture two of Saruman's spies who have maps and charts of the Shire, further confirming Saruman's betrayal. Screamer keeps his encounter with the Nazgul to himself. So, funnily enough, even before the War of the Ring has truly kicked off, Saruman is actively betraying Sauron, Sauron is aware of Saruman's betrayal, and Saruman is aware that Sauron knows of his betrayal. So any conversation through the Palantir would be quite awkward. Saruman is probably lying, Sauron is aware that Saruman is probably lying, and Saruman is aware that his lies probably aren't working. For Saruman, this made his victory condition very simple. He must acquire the One Ring, or he was screwed. If Sauron was victorious over the Free Peoples, he would then come for Saruman, unlikely to have forgiven his betrayal, and that was a war that Saruman could not win. The same was true if the Free Peoples managed to topple Sauron. They too would come for Saruman, and once again he would not be able to win. For Sauron, things were obviously less urgent. Saruman was by far the weaker partner in the relationship, and needed Sauron far more than Sauron needed him. However, the situation did become urgent once the Fellowship was attacked at Amon Hen. Both Ugluk from Isengard and Grishnak from Mordor had orders to take the halflings alive and deliver them to their respective masters, at Isengard and at Barad-dûr. Neither Ugluk or Grishnak realized the gravity of the mission, and in the end it doesn't matter because Merry and Pippin did not have the One Ring. But Sauron and Saruman were not aware of this. Assuming Saruman was the old man that Aragorn and company briefly encountered in Fangorn, then he almost certainly learned that Ugluk's warband was destroyed. But Sauron probably had no way of knowing, and later briefly assumed that the One Ring had found its way to his disloyal vassal in Isengard. We get a glimpse of Sauron's reaction when Pippin uses the Palantir. "So you have come back. Why have you neglected to report for so long?" says Sauron, assuming that it's Saruman contacting him. But once he realizes it's a hobbit, he says this: "Wait a moment, we shall meet again soon. Tell Saruman that this dainty is not for him. I will send for it at once. Do you understand? Say just that." Interestingly, it seems that there had been no contact between Sauron and Saruman for a while when Saruman launched his attack on Rohan, and Sauron was curious about what Saruman was up to. Even before Pippin used the Palantir, Sauron had dispatched one of his Nazgul to Isengard, possibly already worried that Saruman had acquired the One Ring. Of course, that Nazgul would have arrived and seen that Saruman was trapped in Orthanc and Isengard's power was broken, and shortly after, Sauron received, at least in his mind, confirmation that Saruman did not have the One Ring when Aragorn dared to reveal himself by using the Palantir. We don't know Sauron's reaction to Saruman's apparent demise. It probably worried him, as his enemies were proving to be more resourceful than he expected, but at the same time, it probably also amused him. Saruman's ambition and his willingness to betray both sides had caused his ruin. A wizard should know better, after all. For Sauron, Saruman had been a useful tool, but he was a tool that could not be trusted and had outlived his usefulness. When the mouth of Sauron meets with the host of the West before the Black Gate, he reveals that Sauron wants Isengard back, recognizing its strategic usefulness, but gets one final shot in at Saruman, also revealing that a more trustworthy lieutenant will be based there this time around. So to summarize, Sauron and Saruman were military allies, although loosely, considering that their attacks were not heavily coordinated, and that we only have one instance of their forces collaborating. They did have the same war goals, the same enemies, and in the minds of the Free Peoples, they were allies. But in saying that, Sauron and Saruman were also competing, mostly over the possession of the One Ring, and it was a competition that helped bring about both of their downfalls. So were they allied? Sort of, but not really. Theoden has a great quote for their situation. "But it has long been said, oft evil will shall evil mar." So going back to our original question, did that awesome scene happen? Well, probably not, or at the very least, not at that point in time. We're not sure of when that scene takes place chronologically, but it was probably mid to late February, and given how Sauron reacted to who he assumed was Saruman in the Palantir, it's probable the two were not communicating during this time. But hey, sometimes you gotta go with the rule of cool. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I think it's interesting to compare Saruman and Sauron. Despite being similar in so many ways, their actions couldn't be more different. Sauron was cautious and methodical, whereas Saruman almost immediately shot for the moon. In the end, they both crashed and burned. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're going to betray someone, it's probably best to make sure they don't learn about it multiple times.